Conformément à l'article
interpretation's not working online.
Juste pour que les interprètes puissent évaluer si ça fonctionne.
Oui, écoutez, je pars, mon nom c'est Faisal.
Pouvons-nous suspendre pour 5 minutes?
À cause des difficultés. happen with any human being. Je m'excuse, je présente mes excuses à...
I'm very sorry for this technical issue that was outside of our control, but at least we're getting started now. So a maximum of 5 minutes for your opening remarks, and then we will have a series of questions. So welcome, Ms. Langlois. Please make your opening remarks for a maximum of 5 minutes. You have the floor. Thank you very much, Chair. Ladies and gentlemen, hello, and thank you for the invitation. Amnesty International notes that since April 15th, 2023, thousands of people have been killed or wounded in deliberate or indiscriminate attacks in Sudan as fighting rages between the Rapid Support Forces RSF and the Sudanese Armed Forces SAF, who are clashing in the capital Khartoum and elsewhere in the country, notably in the Darfur and Kordofan regions. The fighting began after months of tension between the two groups over, amongst other things, security force reforms proposed as part of negotiations to establish a new transitional government. The Sudanese Armed Forces SAF are led by General Abdel Fattah al-Burhan, while the Rapid Support Forces are headed by General Mohammed Hamdan Dagalo, also known as Hemeti. Given the scale of the fighting and the organisation of both sides, the situation can be considered as a non-international armed conflict under the terms of the Geneva Conventions. Consequently, it is governed by international humanitarian law, which aims to protect civilian populations and other non-combatants in armed conflict. Amnesty International considers that both the SAF and the RAF are state forces. Various non-state armed groups and militias are also involved in the conflict, more broadly in violence. Dozens of women and girls were raped by belligerents from both sides. This conflict has stretched for more than a year now and continues to spread across the country, and the town of El Fasher in North Darfur is now encircled, and in fact it has now been encircled by the Rapid Support Forces and allied militias. It has over 1.5 million people, including hundreds of thousands of internally displaced persons who are now trapped inside the city and risk being the victims of massive violations, and there could be hundreds of people killed. Amnesty International has received information that there have been fires in villages and many airstrikes and bombardments in residential zones, including in the IDP camp Al-Bushuk, and also blocking the delivery of aid. And Amnesty International conducted an investigation, was able to establish that all parties to the conflict committed serious violations of international human rights law and international humanitarian law. And some of the violence committed by the parties to the conflict constitute war crimes or crimes against humanity. Thousands of men, women and children are caught in the crossfire, and fighters from both sides often use ill-adapted weapons and wide-area explosive ammunition, often position themselves in densely populated residential areas from where they launch attacks. The looting and ransacking of public and private property, including medical and humanitarian infrastructure, is exacerbating the already catastrophic humanitarian situation. Over 70%, perhaps even 80% of hospitals are now not working anymore, non-functional. More than 2.6 million people have been displaced within the country, and around 1.4 million else have fled to neighbouring states where they are living in appalling conditions. More than 6,600 people have died throughout the country, and millions of them are exposed to famine. The humanitarian crisis has been compounded by severe shortages of food, water, medicines and fuel. According to the information that was rendered public in June 2024, more than 750,000 are suffering from food insecurity, and many others are in a food crisis. Fighters, in spite of many declarations for ceasefires, have continued. In last July, Amnesty rendered public a report which talked about a constant flow of arms and weapons into the country, which is leading to further humanitarian crisis without precedent, and the arms embargo in Sudan is totally inefficient. Thank you very much, Chairman.
Merci, Madame Langlois.
Thank you very much, Mr. Langlois. And now, Mr. Diamond, you have the floor for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chair. Before I begin, I just want to say that I am replacing my colleague Mutassim Ali today. who is a world-leading authority on the conflict and on accountability for Sudan, because a close friend of his was killed yesterday in El Fashir, North Darfur. This is the reality for all members of the community, and I want to dedicate this testimony to Mubarak Musa Abusin in his memory. And so we are discussing an atrocity situation that is affecting the same groups and survivors of genocide from 20 years ago. And there's no need really to mention at this point the extent of the humanitarian catastrophe. It's already well known. It's just that the world is largely turning away from the largest humanitarian catastrophe on Earth. More than 10 million displaced, 26.6 million are facing acute hunger, which is more than half the population, threatening to result in 2.5 million deaths by the end of this year alone from famine. And by next year, we may witness the largest mass starvation, largest amount of deaths from starvation we've ever seen in our lifetime. Some even estimating up to 12 or 13 million by next year under these current conditions. So we have no time to waste as the conflict continues. More will continue to get killed every day. As I mentioned, the daily experience of the Sudanese community. And so in April of this year, the Raoul Wallenberg Center, my colleague Mutassim and I led an inquiry into breaches of the Genocide Convention in Darfur. We found, based on our conclusions, that the Rapid Support Forces has committed genocide against the Masalit in West Darfur, and we found reasonable grounds to believe that they are targeting other non-Arab groups with the same intention. For instance, fighters on the ground saying things like, "We decided not to leave any of them alive, not even the children," referring to Masalit, or mocking dead bodies along littered the streets as, quote, speed bumps or dirty dogs. Many of this incitement is worse than early 2000s, the first genocide of the 21st century. Now, this is more than just an internal armed conflict because we know that it is being fueled by outside actors, as we also identified in our report, multiple outside actors who are either supporting the warring parties or fighters on the ground through smuggling arms or financing or political cover. And the UAE is the largest backer, most notorious, and it was just confirmed not only by the New York Times investigation, but other sources, including the UN panel of experts, Amnesty, and other investigators, that the UAE is smuggling arms through Chad, heavy weaponry, drones, and there are even hundreds of thousands of mercenaries who have been reported as fighting alongside the RSF, foreign mercenaries. So this is very much funded by and fueled by outside actors as well. And so what can Canada do? Because Canada is not powerless to act, to intervene. Canada has a long tradition of civilian protection, peacekeeping, and responsibility to protect. One, Canada can recognize this genocide for what it is. There has been no atrocity determination yet, and it can invoke responsibility to protect, and it can lead on protection of civilians through diplomacy, through dispatching a civilian protection mechanism in the areas where there are more civilians, the most civilians at most risk. 2, 3, we can end all military exports to the UAE, pending demonstrable halt to their arming of the RSF, the genocidal militia in Sudan, according to our treaty obligations under the Arms Trade Treaty and the Exports and Imports Permit Act. 4, Canada has only sanctioned 6 individuals and entities connected to Sudan, whereas this is the least out of any of Canada's main allies. It has yet to sanction 10 of the entities based in Sudan or the UAE that the US has already sanctioned and that others have sanctioned. We will submit a list to the subcommittee afterwards, and Canada is well placed to take on a case unilaterally or with allies to the International Court of Justice against the UAE for complicity in breaching the Genocide Convention through the smuggling of arms to the genocidal militia, and we are prepared to take on this case. We have pleadings already prepared and drafted. Canada's immigration policy must respond to this unprecedented emergency, speed up the processing times to save at least some of the millions of Sudanese people displaced by this conflict. Not a single Sudanese displaced person has been resettled since the financially burdensome program has been introduced in February, capped at 3,250 people. By contrast, as soon as Russia's war of aggression broke out, Canada launched an emergency family reunification program for Ukraine without eligibility or financial requirements and has approved nearly 1 million applications under this program. These delays are costing lives, and we're talking about the most lethal famine in decades, genocide, and the largest humanitarian catastrophe. I can't imagine a situation that demands an emergency resettlement program more. Instead, Canada has effectively closed its doors on Sudanese people and turned its back on Sudan. This widely disparate response to the war in Ukraine and Sudan is a scandal of the first order and can only be explained by a discriminatory, frankly racist implementation of policy towards communities fleeing conflict. The Parliament should also revive the All-Party Save Darfur coalition that was chaired by our founder, Erwin Kotler, or a broader coalition to prevent genocide and atrocity crimes. Canada can also monitor the incitement to genocide from here in Canada and implement the laws here we have to criminalize those acts. And we can also ramp up humanitarian aid, whereas only 50% of the required aid has reached Sudan out of the 2.1 billion that has been pledged. And this can go directly and should go directly to the grassroots mutual aid initiatives on the ground or emergency response rooms, which have only received 0.2% this year of the actual international aid. Canada can lead on all of these fronts and more. Thank you so much for your time, and I look forward to the questions.
Thank you, Mr. Diamond. And now we would like to start with our first round of questions. I would like to invite Mr. El-Ihsassi to take the floor for 7 minutes. À vous la parole.
Thank you very much. Also to our witnesses, that was really effective advocacy.
Point d'ordre, Monsieur le Président, il y a un problème avec.
There's a problem with interpretation. Perhaps the mic wasn't opened properly. It was inaudible for the interpreter.
Okay, can you check?
So allow me to start off by thanking the witnesses. All good?
Okay, keep going.
Excellent. And I would like to point out, Mr. Diamond, you were here in Ottawa last few days before summer recess for Parliament, active. You did a media availability, so thank you so much for all the hard work you've put into this and for the excellent report that the Centre has produced. But allow me to start off with our other witness from Amnesty International. You did touch on the fact that the arms embargo is ineffective. I was wondering if you could elaborate on that, because obviously there's much more that we can do as a country, and I'd be grateful if you could provide us more guidance on the arms embargo.
Yes, thank you. Comme je le disais,
As I was saying, Amnesty International has carried out an investigation, and in last June we published a report specifically on the flow and the sales of arms. We've seen that several states, in spite of the embargo, are continuing to transfer arms one way or another to this country, particularly Serbia and China. They're delivering them to belligerents in Sudan. And my colleague has also touched on this. So what can Canada do? It can renew the mandate of the International Fact-Finding Mission to Sudan, which is currently being dealt with at the UN General Session, and also to extend the embargo, the arms embargo, on the whole country and ensure that it actually becomes effective. There are many arms or weapon components within Sudan. They arrive there directly or indirectly. In particular, arms, which are not actually for belligerent purposes, but they're blank guns, and then they're trafficked afterwards, and then they end up in the hands of the two warring factions. And we can certainly transfer to you the report, which gives all of the details on these particular facts.
Thank you very much for that. Mr. Diamond, given that there were so many external players involved fueling the dispute here, whether, as was pointed out, whether it's China, Serbia, UAE, Egypt, why are so many countries involved and engaged in the terrible things that are going on in Sudan?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. I would say actually these states are profiting off of the suffering of the Sudanese people. And for instance, the UAE is, and for many countries, it's about seeking access to land, resources, the seaport. You know, in particular, the gold trade is fairly large and active in the region. So gold is a major source of funding for countries like the UAE and Russia that are conspiring to basically extract and colonize and steal from the Sudanese people. So that's the way I would frame it. Actually, while Sudanese people are dying on a daily basis and being killed by these armed forces and militias, the enablers are actually getting away scot-free from their homes in Dubai, let's say, or Abu Dhabi, and they're actually making money off of this because they're smuggling out, the kind of natural resources and access that serves them. So I would say it's really about, that's what makes it so pernicious, and that's what makes these initiatives that I mentioned before about going after, for instance, at the International Court of Justice or through sanctions, the entities and states that are benefiting from this conflict, to hold them accountable. This is a massive impunity gap, and so it's not only about holding fighters on the ground, let's say, accountable. It's about support. It's about their enablers and sponsors. It's very clear that they cannot and they would collapse, and the fighting would end without the support of the UAE, for instance. The UAE more so than any other country. But as you mentioned, countries like Russia, China, Turkey, Iran, Serbia have also been identified as supporting, but not to the same extent in terms of finances, political backing, diplomatic cover, and of course, supplying with heavy weaponry and drones, which the UAE is now increasingly implicated in, and has to be called out, sanctioned, and taken to court over these continued violations. Otherwise the war will continue. These are the drivers of conflict, and that's why they're the key targets to look at.
Thank you. So if you could provide us any additional information as to how you think that these other countries could be held to account, that would be very much welcome. Mr. Diamond, you touched on another thing, which was the family reunification program that we had announced last year. Just to let you know, the Globe and Mail last year, February 2024, had a headline that read, "Canada prepares to welcome thousands of Sudanese." However, there were very, very few Sudanese who have come here. That is very disconcerting. Do you have any recommendations on that particular front, just to make sure that Canada does open its doors to people who are fleeing the situation in Sudan?
Can you hear me? Sorry, I think my
Yes.
my phone disconnected. Oh, yeah. So one of my recommendations is for Canada to introduce an emergency visa program in the same way that was introduced for Ukrainians fleeing conflict, which has yet to be done. There's only this reunification program that has been capped at 3,250 that has financial requirements and other biometric requirements that the Ukrainian program didn't have. So we have the capacity. It's a matter of political will, and it, at least as a signal. It's not a matter of resettling everyone. It's a matter of simply introducing a program that will allow for these processing times to be sped up, and so that the families who do have a chance to make it here can come in an expedited, immediate manner, because there are stories of families. You can speak to Canadian families that have lost loved ones who were waiting, due to IRCC delays. So this is costing lives. The fact that there is not yet a comprehensive emergency visa program for Sudanese Canadians.
Thank you, Mr. Al-Ihsassi. Thank you, Mr. Diamond. And now I would like to invite Mr. Guinness to take the floor for 7 minutes, please.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to the witnesses for powerful and sobering testimony. Briefings that I've received on the crisis in Sudan suggest that the ongoing violence combined with the humanitarian consequences make this likely to be the worst humanitarian crisis since the so-called Great Leap Forward in China in the 1950s. You talked about a scenario of mass starvation, potentially up to 12 to 13 million people next year. To put that in context, that is well over 5 times the total population of the Gaza Strip. And I don't think very many Canadians are aware of the particulars of this crisis. I think it would be deeply troubling to many Canadians to find out some of the facts you shared. Tens of millions of people affected by acute hunger already. And at a minimum, this is a situation that requires our serious attention and intense resolve and response. It seems to me, based on what I've read in your testimony today, that a critical step forward would be to do more to block the flow of arms into Sudan by shaming and penalizing any country or non-state actor sending weapons to either side. Just briefly, would both witnesses agree with that in principle?
Yeah, I'm happy to elaborate on that.
Okay, and from Amnesty, would you agree with that?
I'm sorry, can you repeat your questions? I just
I've
just been informed that my micro is not working well. I hope it is working now.
On time, but the question was, would you agree that a critical step forward would be for us to take action to block the flow of arms into Sudan, shaming and penalizing any country sending weapons to either side?
Yes, I will agree. I'm sorry, I think that there's a problem with my micro. I hope you can hear me.
Thank you. I'll proceed and we'll dig into this a bit further. This is a proxy war, different actors sending weapons in and waging a conflict at the expense of the Sudanese people. Many of the players are unsurprising, are involved in fomenting conflict and violence in other parts of the world. Unsurprisingly, the governments of Iran and Russia are involved. But the UAE is a player that we have more of a relationship with, let's say, than some of the others. There are many very serious allegations about the UAE that they are actively supporting the RSF, which is committing genocide. And also there's some detailed analysis in the New York Times suggesting that the UAE is misusing the Red Crescent as a way of trying to cover for their efforts to smuggle arms into Sudan. My understanding of international law is that if this is true, this would make the UAE not only guilty of supporting perpetrators of war crimes, but guilty of war crimes themselves by misusing the Red Crescent. So maybe Mr. Diamond, if you can comment on the UAE's actions here and what we can do to put maximal pressure on the UAE as part of a campaign to keep arms from flowing into Sudan.
Yeah, thank you, MP Genius. The UAE, as you note, yes, I mean, Canada, it still remains Canada within the top 20 importers of Canadian military exports. And so, yes, there's a lot that Canada can do to end this, at least put pressure on the UAE so that our weapons don't become complicit in, I mean, that Canada's weapons don't become complicit in their crimes in Sudan. You know, so under the arms trade treaty obligations, you know, the purpose is to prevent and eradicate the illicit trade of arms. Canada is a state party, right? Ratified the convention and has enshrined it in domestic law. But, you know, this requires oversight also by Parliament. You can't just rely on the minister to, you know, end all permits until the UAE proves that it is not funding genocide, sending these weapons to genocidaires. Unlike other situations, these transfers may further breach, as we talked about, the UN arms embargo. There's already a UN arms embargo. So there's plenty of legal grounds to bar the flow of arms to the UAE, you know.
Can I just jump in because of limited time? So, not exporting Canadian arms to the UAE is one recommendation. What other steps would you suggest to apply pressure to the UAE? And I should mention Egypt as well is believed to be supporting the other side of the conflict. And Egypt is a country that we have a relationship with much warmer in general than with some of the other belligerent supporters.
Yeah, but I mean, for in terms of the UAE, we know that the evidence is a lot more solid, and it's supporting a side that is, you know, committing mass killing against, massacring non-Arab groups, and committing mass rape and sexual and gender-based violence against members of these communities based on their identity. So the House can also pass a motion, you know, outlining and calling for ceasing the transfer of arms per this legislation, right? In the same way that the House passed Motion 658, right, ending the arms exports to Israel and Hamas. I understand that's not binding, but at least that is something that might get the ball rolling on this initiative to end arms transfer to the UAE until they end their support for the RSF. Yeah, so it's one thing for the government to claim, you know, if there aren't being arms, but we need more parliamentary oversight if the UAE continues to be our top 20 importer of exports for military goods.
Which other players should we be paying attention to in terms of that are contributing to the conflict?
Excuse me, Mr. Guinness, time is out, and probably in the next round. Few seconds, please. I would appreciate that. Si vous pouvez répondre à Monsieur Gunn.
If you could give an answer within a few seconds, Mr. Diamond, that would be much appreciated in response to Mr. Genuis.
I think, would my colleague like to answer this? So, I mean, we mentioned some of the other actors. Amnesty put out a report. Others have put out reports. The panel of experts, the UN panel of experts, is continuing to monitor this. Russia, the Wagner Group, and China, Turkey, Iran, Serbia. But the state that we have been following most closely, and the one where most of the entities that have been sanctioned already are based in the UAE and are supporting the RSF. And we've heard in our own diplomatic discussions, right, that without the UAE support, the RSF would collapse. And so this is, probably the biggest exporter of conflict on the continent, the UAE. And so we need to increase the pressure and actually focus on imposing costs on the UAE, not allowing it to get away with this.
And now, j'invite Monsieur Alex Brunel Duceppe.
And now, Mr. Alexa Brunel Duceppe, you have the floor for 6 minutes. Thank you, Madame Langlois and Mr. Diamond, for being here with us. I'll start quickly with a question to you, Ms. Langlois. We have heard some recommendations from both of you and from others when it comes to the conflict in Sudan. What would be the most specific amnesty recommendations? It would be useful if you could name those for the committee. Thank you, and I hope that the microphone is working this time. So there's no miracle solution. It's important for Canada to play its role within the UN on the international stage as a champion of human rights. That's what we claim to be, after all. And Canada has to make sure that we can renew the mandate of the International Fact-Finding Mission to Sudan. And Canada also needs to exert pressure so that the UN arms embargo can be further extended to the whole country, and in particular, the resources and the political influence of Canada needs to be used to ensure that aid really reaches those that really need it. We really need to have a coordinated international response, and we need to have really great pressure on the belligerents because they're blocking access to vital aid. And that's the only way we can avoid this massive famine that's already started. And it's the only way we can alleviate the suffering of millions of people. We really have to insist upon the fact that we are indeed talking about millions of people who are greatly suffering. And there's the risk that they will be victims of crime and also crimes against humanity. So Canada has to exert all of its weight on all of its various partners on the international scene so that we can come up with robust solutions, and real pressure has to be exerted. And once again, there's the question of the arms embargo. The embargo exists, but it's ineffective currently, so we need to render it effective. And then there's all of the allies in the region that are consciously sending weapons to the belligerents within Sudan. But there's also the indirect arms sales to other states who then transfer arms. Sometimes there's several stages involved in the arms trade, so it's very important for Canada itself to ensure that weapons or weapon components that it's selling are sold to countries that are not directly or indirectly transferring weapons or weapon components to Sudan, even if they are a priori non-lethal weapons. They should not be transferred. Thank you very much for these specific details. You referred to pressure being exerted by Canada and the UN. And this conflict didn't just start 2 weeks ago. It's been ongoing. And it's just getting worse as the situation's exacerbating. We're seeing one of the worst famines of the 21st century in Sudan. It's nothing new. We're talking about Canada needing to exert pressure on the UN because historically, and it's Sovereignist Québécois who's saying this, but Canada has a whole history in terms of human rights and international human rights. If we think about Mr. Mulroney, for example, and his heritage and his stance against apartheid in South Africa. So according to you, and it's a question to both of the witnesses, perhaps one of you knows this, have you heard arguments being presented by Bob Rae, the Canadian ambassador, on the question of the conflict in Sudan? Have we already heard something from Mr. Bob Rae on this matter? Recently, no. We do understand that states' attention are turned towards the conflict between Israel and Hamas. Currently, it's terrible. There's also Ukraine and other conflicts raging in the world, but it's important to keep an eye on all of these different conflicts, and we need to have a consistent policy when it comes to our policies and positions. The time is now for Canada to stand up and once again become a staunch champion of human rights on the international stage. So there have been no representations, no arguments put forward by the Canadian ambassador to the UN on the Sudanese conflict. That was my conflict, and the answer is that you've not heard about any of these representations. We will do a research. Perhaps there has been something, but as far as you know, the answer is no. But Amnesty is certainly calling for more pressure to be put on our UN partners. Now, Mr. Diamond, in one of the questions, you answered that one of the main issues was the processing times for people who want to leave Sudan and come here to Canada. When I was vice chair of the Special Committee on Afghanistan, in the report we included a recommendation which stated that Canada and, in fact, the IRCC, should have an urgency mechanism. So when there's this type of international crisis that occurs, then when that starts abroad, whether it's an armed conflict or a natural disaster, the IRCC needs to have some sort of emergency mechanism so that they can act quickly, because with Afghanistan, it took several months, even years, to help these people. So according to you, do you think that this mechanism, which has still not been set up, Mr. Fraser and Mr. Miller were working on this, but do you think it would be useful to have this type of emergency mechanism to help with this Sudanese conflict?
Yeah, any emergency program that will open the doors to Sudanese displaced people from conflict. These are the most vulnerable people in the world. You know, they can't go back. These are survivors of genocide who have lost family members, who are, emaciated to the bone often. It's horrific, and they don't have anywhere else to go. And so, the largest displacement crisis in the world demands this sort of program. It's beyond belief that there isn't.
Merci, Alexis.
Thank you very much, Alexis. Time is up. So now,
the floor for 7 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and I want to thank Mr. Diamond and Ms. Langlois, both of you, for the incredible work that you and the organizations you represent do on behalf of people around the world. The data shows only about half of the 2024 Sudan humanitarian response plan is actually funded, with $1.34 billion US in unmet funding needs. And to date, Canada's contribution to this plan represents 1.6% of funding commitments, despite our much larger share of the global economy. Do you believe Canada needs to increase its financial commitments to trusted humanitarian partners operating in Sudan, and encourage other donors to do the same? And also, maybe you can comment on how the government's cuts to Canada's international assistance budget during a time of rising global violence, hunger, and suffering is impacting our reputation as an international human rights leader. And I'll start with you, Mr. Diamond.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, humanitarian aid is the primary responsibility that Canada needs to ramp up its support for, and then complement that with real policies to get that aid to the groups that have proven effective. After the revolution, youth-led movements, mutual aid groups on the ground that are more effective than international aid groups often. And so the funding also needs to be distributed in a way that's effective and supporting the heroic work of the people on the ground.
Ms. Langlois, do you care to add anything as well on that question?
Well, c'est toujours insuffisant.
It's always insufficient. Canadian international aid is always lacking in general. We don't live up to our commitments. That's on the one hand. And then the other hand, in terms of humanitarian aid with this type of crisis, we should never reduce it. So it really is insufficient, is my clear answer.
Thank you. There's reports of sexual violence that have been highlighted, in the conflict's disproportionate impact on women and girls, with ongoing allegations of rape and forced marriages, sexual slavery, and trafficking, particularly in Khartoum and Darfur and Kordofan. The UN Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs has warned that as millions of civilians flee these conflict areas, both within Sudan and neighboring countries, women face increased vulnerabilities. How can international efforts better address the specific vulnerabilities of women and girls in conflict zones in Sudan, and what measures could be taken to prevent sexual violence in areas where civilians are fleeing conflict? Maybe Ms. Langlois, if you want to lead, and I'm happy to take more comments from Mr. Diamond as well.
That's a very big question that you're putting. It's an enormous issue at stake throughout the world in all of these conflicts since time immemorial. The question of sexual violence against women and girls is always a major issue. What can we do? There needs to be humanitarian aid that lives up to its name and really steps in to help women and girls who are victims of sexual violence currently. And once again, I believe that Canada can show commitment and show leadership, not just in the current crisis, but in general, also to address this issue during conflicts. Mechanisms need to be developed for monitoring purposes. And then there's also the question of training of belligerents and national armies and so on in a well-supervised way, but it's a long-term solution that needs to be developed, and certainly Canada has an important role to play. And those who are held or found guilty of these crimes have to be brought before justice and condemned.
Mr. Diamond, you talked also about the 12 to 13 million people that could die from famine. And the International Crisis Group also reported that Sudan is experiencing, obviously, this severe humanitarian crisis with famine that's imminent, and 90% of people facing acute food insecurity that are trapped in the conflict in Greater Khartoum, Gezira, and Al-Fashir. The Sudanese armed forces and the rapid support forces are obstructing aid delivery, with the Sudanese armed forces denying UN agencies permission to deliver assistance in the RSF-controlled areas where hunger is most severe. Can you talk about what is the latest information on the obstruction of aid delivery in Sudan, and how can the obstruction of aid delivery in Sudan be addressed, and what more can Canada do?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. I mean, it's catastrophic, and Reuters just also put out a special report on this. And one thing, I mean, as we mentioned, the UN, Canada can seek to lead efforts at the UN also to remove the consent of the state. You know, a lot of times countries are citing that, oh, Sudan has the right to, we need their consent, but there's no governing party right now. There's no effective, legitimate leader right now that can lay claim to this. This is a problem of international scope that demands responsibility to protect civilian protection in those areas that you mentioned, and the removal of the obstacles to impediments to letting the trucks go through. And so this is something that Canada in the House can demand, that you know that the requirement that consent of state is removed, because these people are starving to death. You know, it's just, it makes no sense to allow Sudan, as the Sudanese armed forces, to continue blocking that aid. And the same with the RSF. I just also want to quickly clarify, because there is, it sounds like there is some confusion in the room around, I mean, Sudan is a massive country, and the reason you hear about Darfur a lot is because the situation as Darfur is quite different, where the RSF controls most of the region. In North Darfur, there's only one SAF garrison left, and there's joint forces that are fighting off the RSF's siege. But when I talk about the RSF atrocities and you know the UAE support for them, it's continuing the genocide and massacres of the Masalit Fur and Zagawa people. And the UN found that 81% of rape and sexual violence was committed by the RSF. And so the conflict really has to be understood as not simply two belligerents, but they are committing different sorts of crimes. Whereas the SAF, like I said, is blocking this aid and potentially contributing to the deaths by starvation and committing airstrikes and war crimes, killing civilians in that context.
Mr. Diamond, if you could wrap it up, please. Time as you exceed 1 minute almost. Thank you.
I just wanted to say that the focus on Darfur, where these are survivors of genocide from 20 years ago and are now facing it again, is a different nature of threat and vulnerability, just to say.
Thank you, Mr. John. Now I would like to invite Madame Damoff, please.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to both. We talked a lot about the UAE. I want to talk a little bit right now about Russia. There was a report I read called Blood Gold, and it was about how Russia, through the Wagner Group, has raised $2.5 billion US from trade in African gold since it invaded the Ukraine in February of 2022. In Sudan, a Russian company controls a major refinery that has allowed Wagner to become the dominant buyer of unprocessed Sudanese gold, with multiple accounts of Russian military transport planes shipping processed gold out of the country. I'm just wondering if either of you have want to speak to that and the influence that the Wagner Group is having in Sudan. Mr. Diamond, I see you're shaking your head. Go ahead.
Oh yeah, and I was waiting because I believe Amnesty also identified Russia, but yeah, I mean, this is not something that I've personally been involved in investigating, but we have heard in our discussions that, of course, the same way Russia has continued to sort of wade through the sanctions by the international community. Part of that is the gold trade, and so countries like Russia and UAE are aligning themselves in a way that they can weather these kind of storms, and that's really important to track and to try and target those networks that are operating in the shadows, smuggling underneath the scrutiny of international mechanisms.
Did Amnesty want to comment as well?
I don't have much to add. We know that Russia contributes to the arming of the belligerent forces, the warring factions in Sudan. And what you've put forward is very plausible and very possible, but that very much goes beyond my expertise. I don't have any specific information vis-a-vis Amnesty reports on this subject.
Okay, thank you. Human Rights Watch indicated that the signing of the Juba Peace Agreement in October 2020 between Sudan's transitional government and the country's rebel groups paradoxically gave rise to new group recruitment in Darfur. How can the international community support and foster the conditions for peace that do not unintentionally result in the entrenchment of violence? Maybe I'll turn to Amnesty if that's okay. If you want it.
Well, once again, that's a big question.
There's no miracle solution to implement everything to ensure that the respect of international human rights law, international humanitarian law, diplomacy and negotiations. We have to use the international system as best we can, which already exists and which is really ailing at the moment, unfortunately.
Mr. Diamond, did you want to add anything?
No, I mean that's a really excellent question and very difficult. I think more important focus, while these are, there's an interplay, but the need to protect civilians needs to be at top of mind and guiding the discussions because there's no end in sight to the war, and so we can't really discuss what the future of Sudan will look like right now until the the warring parties can no longer receive the supplies they need, and until that they cease fighting and that the civilians receive the protection that they need, from an international monitoring force or mechanism. Yeah, so I would say that the focus really can't be yet on that, but it has to be on how the international community can intervene to stop the violence.
Okay, I think I only have 15 seconds left, so I'll give it back to the chair.
Thank you, Ms. Damoff. Thank you. And now I would like to invite Mr. Majumdar to take the floor for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. If colleagues would agree, I wouldn't mind taking a bit of a step back from the specific conflict and its contours in Sudan into a bit more of a broader perspective here. Commentary opened up this discussion by describing 12 million people potentially dying from starvation, making this the biggest refugee crisis, the biggest starvation crisis of this century, and perhaps even in history. Can I ask, it does deserve deep attention. Should the international conversation not be more affected by what we are seeing happen in this crisis in Sudan? If I could turn to both our colleagues from Amnesty International and Raoul Wallenberg to try from their perspective explain, despite their advocacy, their research, their work, their policy recommendations, their appeals to governments around the world, why is it that this is a crisis that is not getting the attention it deserves? Perhaps Amnesty could start.
Merci. C'est une très bonne.
Thank you. That's a very good question. Once again, it's a very broad-based one. Unfortunately, Sudan is not the sole conflict. It's not the sole humanitarian crisis that's not being given sufficient attention currently. The reason for this is that the international system is no longer working. The United Nations is no longer working. The UN Security Council is no longer working either because it's become too politicized. It's always been politicized, but before there was more of a balance. And now the parties that are actually taking decisions at the UN Security Council and the UN General Assembly no longer care about the humanitarian law balance because it no longer works for them. So each state, for example, China, Russia, also the US, they use their veto as soon as something doesn't suit them. The system really is broken, and that is why everything becomes highly politicized, and our attention is diverted elsewhere. And in the meantime, the states within the UN Security Council are actually stoking these conflicts throughout the world while our backs are turned and the cameras, the media and the lights are not at all trained on these crises. So we have to work on repairing the UN system.
Appreciate that perspective on how the UN system is broken and is failing the people of Sudan. Perhaps then our colleague at the Raoul Wallenberg Center could spend some time describing why is it that the major media have not been appropriately shedding the kind of attention that this crisis warrants?
Yeah, no, I think that's the ultimate question and a very painful one to think about. I also just want to add regarding the Wagner Group that the Raoul Wallenberg Center did submit a comprehensive sanctions filing with the government, including Wagner Group. And, unfortunately, the government didn't respond a timely enough fashion. I also want to sort of put it in there and a recommendation to, take these recommendations and to have quicker processing times for our, sort of sanctions recommendations, because often the companies that are then suggested to be sanctioned can switch hands and liquidate and evade accountability. I also want to say that regarding the peace agreement question, in the past, the peace agreement has been bilateral, and so any future agreement really needs to be comprehensive and all-inclusive with all parties, including those who have been, historically marginalized and oppressed in Darfur. Otherwise, it will continue to breed resentment and kind of neglect. And in terms of the lack of attention, there's really there's no explanation for it. I mean, other than a derelict of duty by everyone in any form of power or anyone who has a platform. Because there's also a lot of inaccurate information, even a failure to even document basic information about Sudan, and yeah, there's no way to explain it other than a failure.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Majumdar. Now, j'invite Monsieur Alexis Brunel-Duceppe.
And now, Mr. Alexis Brunel-Duceppe, you have 5 minutes. You have the floor. Thank you, Chair. I think that all of us today around the table and our witnesses today, I think we all share the same feeling of frustration. We know that this conflict is completely being ignored, even if it's the conflict that has the highest murderous potential, if we just look in terms of the famine-related numbers and what it may become. I've just listened to your answers, and you've said that the UN is broken, there's no media attention, it's turning towards the Middle East, Ukraine, Russia instead. So I'd like to ask Mr. Diamond something. Do we know the position of the African Union on this file currently?
That's a good question. The African Union has a special advisor on the prevention of genocide who is very committed to this. And, I spent some time at the African Union meeting with missions earlier this year. And to be honest, I mean, a lot of African countries are both, looking to have this synergistic sort of collaborative approach with UK, US, and Canada and others. We're looking to each other to lead on this, because the African Union can't do this alone. There are a lot of other constraints affecting the AU, but they've had some calls for outlining the need for protection of civilians mechanisms, and for they're calling out external actors as clearly involved in the conflict, but we've yet to see it move past that phase to becoming something concrete in something that will be provided by states in the region. But the AU can certainly continue to play a role, but it has to be an international effort as well.
Recently, within the framework of a mission, I went to Kenya and Rwanda. And obviously, we see that there's an increasing presence of China there, and the influence of the Chinese Communist Party in the current conflict. You referred to the European Union, but I imagine that the Chinese interests are involved here because it's an African conflict. You referred to the African Union. Well, I'm putting question to you, Madame Langlois. Thank you. Yes, is the answer. China is indeed one of the main countries providing arms to Sudan currently. global geopolitics really is at the heart of this type of conflict here in Sudan and in most of the other conflicts. Thank you very much. That's where I was heading, because in the meantime, humanitarian aid isn't getting through, and probably this was one of the territories where there was the highest child malnutrition rates in the world, even before the conflict broke out. We're talking about 600,000 children who were in a state of malnutrition before the conflict. And now the big players on the international stage are playing this risky game with Sudan. And what you're asking for, and the message I'm hearing today, is that these players have to facilitate the passage of humanitarian aid and the arms embargo, and then that would give us a glimmer of hope. Have I correctly interpreted your message? The short answer would be yes. States, countries such as Canada have to shoulder their responsibilities, play their role, and ensure that the rules of the game are actually respected, and humanitarian law has to be respected, and we have to ensure that humanitarian aid can get through to civilians. We have to protect civilians. Once again, the two parties in this conflict will be held accountable of war crimes and probably also crimes against humanity as we speak. Is my time up? Thank you very much, Mr. Bruno Duceppe.
John, to take the floor for 5 minutes, please.
Well, thank you again both for your really important testimony today. Mr. Diamond, you talked about the resettlement program, and first, the amount of people that are in the resettlement program compared to that of Ukraine. You also talked about the barriers in terms of the requirements and the thresholds. Can you speak about, what those barriers look like, what needs to change in terms of the existing amount of people, and then why the government may have such a low number compared to that of Ukraine, and this discrimination that we're seeing?
Yeah, and I mean, I think you said it. It's, unfortunately, kind of insidiously motivated by that. I can't really think of any other explanation. But for the Ukraine program, there were no eligibility or financial requirements or any cap, for the duration of the war. So it's not a question of whether or not it's, there's an ability to do that. And the precedent is there. So, that's all I'll say about that. I also wanted to say, in terms of how Canada can lead, it is strange that only 4 of the entities related to Sudan have been sanctioned. I mean, how is that possible if the U.S. has sanctioned over 10 entities that Canada hasn't yet sanctioned? And Canada also has played a role at the ICJ. It has, it's leading 2 cases there against Afghanistan and Iran for the downing of PS-752. These are efforts that Canada, you need a state to bring a case to the International Court of Justice, and that will really raise the profile of the Sudanese conflict, and then we'll initiate a process of accountability at the international level. And we are willing to work with you on this. And so I just want to say that Canada is very well placed and has experience in this area, and we're ready to work with Canada.
Okay. Last week at the UN General Assembly, the European Union and several countries stepped forward with additional funding commitments to address the humanitarian needs in Sudan. Well, Canada failed to do the same. There were also calls for those within the international community to push for diplomatic solutions to this crisis. How can Canada take more of a leadership role in delivering humanitarian aid to people in Sudan and in negotiating diplomatic solutions? And I'll go to you, Ms. Langlois.
Le Canada doit agir en cohérence.
Canada has to be consistent with its international discourse. We come out and speak strongly about human rights and humanitarian rights, but when it's time to act, it's not quite as obvious that Canada's there. Canada has to shoulder its responsibilities. We've already done that in the past. As I've said, it can do it and it should act. Thank you. That's my answer.
Mr. Diamond, did you want to add?
No, I mean, I just think it's very clear that more can be done because, you cited all the statistics. There's no limit to what Canada can do in terms of increasing its humanitarian fund. I'm not a development expert, though. My expertise really lies in the accountability at the international, regional, and domestic levels.
Okay, our critic for foreign affairs, Heather McPherson, she wrote a letter calling on Canada to impose sanctions immediately for those responsible for violations of international law and human rights. This is a year ago. She called on Sudanese authorities to immediately surrender the suspects there was already outstanding arrest warrants to the International Criminal Court to support and push for the expeditious issuance of arrest warrants by the ICC against those suspected of committing war crimes, crimes against humanity, and genocide, and also called on the Sudanese authorities to immediately secure visas and unfettered access to areas of interest for staff of International Criminal Court's Office of the Prosecutor, and work to build support among international partners to push for a United Nations Security Council referral of the situation in Sudan. Can you give a grade on how Canada's doing, Mr. Diamond, in terms of response to those requests that the NDP's made?
Quick answer,
Well,
quick answer, please, Mr. Diamond. We have 20 seconds.
I haven't really seen any progress on this front, but I want to add that the International Criminal Court is not the only form of accountability. I want to go back to the International Court of Justice as an opportunity for Canada to really take the lead and impose a cost and enforce a judgment potentially against the United Arab Emirates, which even by bringing to court is a matter of harming reputation and potentially enough pressure to exert their influence on the RSF to withdraw and end their atrocities in Darfur.
Thank you all so much. Really appreciate your testimony.
I would like to invite Madame Anita Vandenberg to take the floor for 5 minutes, please.
Very much. I just want to thank all of the, or both of the witnesses for, and those that came before you, for very, very alarming testimony and being able to raise the spotlight on something that I think if Canadians knew more about, would want to do more. I know that Canada has already provided about $300 million in aid to Sudan and the surrounding area in the last 2 years, and our last budget has $350 million additional money for humanitarian aid. But knowing that this is a human rights committee, and it's not specifically on development or some of the other recommendations. I noted in your opening remarks, Ms. Langlois, that you talked about the violations of international human rights law and humanitarian law, but because it's an internal conflict, you made the distinction in terms of the Geneva Convention and other kinds of international law. I wonder if you could specify and then leave a little bit of time, I think, for Mr. Diamond to also respond about specifically the violations that are happening right now of international human rights law and what Canada can do to ensure that those violations stop.
Merci pour la question. Alors,
Thank you for that question. Civilians are being targeted blindly, and the two warring parties position themselves in civilian zones to launch their attacks, and so they are endangering civilians, and there's tens of thousands of civilians who have been killed and injured. We refer to sexual violence against women and children, and there's also the question of humanitarian aid that's not able to get through because access to humanitarian aid is being blocked. And they also target civilian facilities providing water or electricity, and that also has an impact, of course, on the civilian population. So it's all of these measures that are condemned under international human rights law. It also applies in a conflict such as the Sudanese conflict, which is not between two states, not an international conflict, therefore, but under the Geneva Convention or under international law, this still can apply between the two warring factions within the same country.
Oh, if I may add, I just want to say, in terms of what the international community has been able to do, though, to stop those kind of violations, historically, the International Criminal Court tried to issue an arrest warrant, let's say, against al-Bashir. And I just want to note that the traditional ways of doing things might have brought us to this point and are not necessarily the best forms of deterrent. Concrete ways of maybe stopping the violence is to block the flow of what's the sources of their funding? Where are they getting their military supplies? How are they able to continue these atrocities? That obviously will penalize them more than the threat of, future sort of prosecutions for violations or like threatening Sudan or RSF with, that they're violating human rights, because we know that really, that's not, when we're speaking of genocide and mass atrocity crimes, I think that we share the same goal, but I'm not quite sure if traditional ways of looking at it are the best way to go about it.
I guess one of the other questions I have for you, Mr. Diamond, regarding the Arms Trade Treaty, in the enabling legislation in Canada, it does actually specify that the minister must not allow an export permit if there's a substantial risk that one of the listed areas, and I believe that was actually an amendment in the Foreign Affairs Committee to say must instead of may. So if you could clarify what might be done differently, given that right now under law, it would actually be illegal to allow that kind of export permit.
This it seems like a little bit of an opaque way of enforcing this sort of law. I'm not exactly sure how the assessment or evaluation works, if it's transparent or not. But certainly, this is something that I believe Parliament can ask and request and demand that all these exports are being reviewed in a way that against the risks that are now known of where these weapons can end up.
Mr. Diamond, you also mentioned that you have, I think there were 10 other entities or individuals that have been sanctioned by other countries like the U.S. that you were going to submit to this committee. I would ask if you could submit those names, and if you wanted to elaborate a little bit on that here.
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, some of these companies are controlling, business interests of the RSF from the UAE, or have sent vehicles armed with machine guns. So these are key entities that Canada has yet to sanction, and I look forward to submitting those names.
And I noticed you mentioned countries like Russia and China, but you also mentioned Serbia. What is the nature of what Serbia is doing in this regard? I can't remember if it was you or if it was Ms. Langlois that mentioned that. Ms. Langlois?
C'est moi qui ai mentionné ça. Donc,
I mentioned this. Serbia and China, please quickly. So Serbia and China are two of the countries that are shipping arms to Sudan, and yet they have indeed signed the arms trade treaty, so they're in contradiction with their own obligations. Thank you very much. And now, Mr. Guinness, you have the floor for 5 minutes.
Today, about tens of millions of people in Sudan displaced, starving, or already killed. We must do more here in Canada. We need to hold all violators of human rights accountable, whether they're on the ground in Sudan itself or whether they are foreign enablers. And we've heard that the Government of Canada has been behind on imposing sanctions, so it's critically important that we tighten those up and, in the process, hold foreign enablers accountable as well. I want to draw your attention to one aspect of recent New York Times reporting. I'm quoting here While not admitting direct support to the RSF, Sheikh Mohammed, that's from the UAE, said he owed the paramilitary group's leader, Lieutenant General Mohammed Hamdan, for sending troops to fight alongside the Emiratis in the war in Yemen. Okay, so one way to think of the war in Sudan is that it's an extension of the war in Yemen, with Iran and the UAE fighting for power and control. It seems, based on what I've read, that Iran would like resources in Sudan, but also a strategic foothold, and that UAE doesn't want Iran to have that strategic foothold. And there are other relationships established in the context of the Yemeni conflict that are spilling over. Mr. Diamond, just very quickly, because I've got limited time, but what are your thoughts on that kind of frame, and what does Iran want in Sudan specifically?
Yeah, I'll say I'm not a geopolitical expert, so I won't try and address that. But I wouldn't say it's only in terms of sort of like fighting over regional control. I think the UAE is also just exploiting this war for control of resources, including the very powerful gold trade. It's just and it's been involved militarily in Ethiopia and Tigray, and also in Libya, where it backs the warlord Khalifa Haftar. So, that's how it's this new form of the way that they're exploiting Africa for its resources.
You started to say the word colonization, so a kind of colonization. Do you think Iran is similarly motivated by resources control, kind of new colonial strategy?
I won't say I know as much about that side.
I want to ask about the Sudanese democracy movement. There was a lot of hope, including in the Sudanese diaspora here in Canada, about what could come about following the initial democratic revolution. What are the prospects for the democracy movement to be able to become a player in the country's politics again, and how can we specifically support the pursuit of the Sudanese people for a free and democratic future?
Je ne sais pas à qui s'adressait la question.
I don't know to whom the question was addressed, but I can try to answer on that. This movement has been completely suppressed, and the current conflict, amongst other things, has arisen as a result of the negotiations for a democratic transition. So that would seem to indicate that hope for the moment for a democratic transition has basically been wiped out. Now, of course, the democratic movement may still exist, but it doesn't have the necessary space anymore in order to be heard. That is why it's important to quickly arrive at a diplomatic solution to resolve this conflict in a negotiated way, so that once again we can go back to this question of democratic transition and put forward the Sudanese democratic movement in its rightful place.
Rather than your recommendation would be that the order of operations is denial of arms, political solution, and then the revivification of the democracy movement. Are there things that we can do in the meantime, though, to support kind of a laying of groundwork by the democracy movement so that they're in a stronger position when hopefully the conflict is brought to an end?
In a 20 seconds, please.
Ms. Langlois.
Oui, bien sûr, il faut continuer.
Of course, we have to continue to support the democratic movement in Sudan and civic society as much as we can. But first of all, there needs to be resolution of the conflict, and we need to stop providing arms to Sudan, and we need to negotiate a transition.
Thank you, Mr. Guinness. I would like to thank our witnesses for your time, for your good answer. The illustration you gave to this committee, to all members, is highly appreciated. Thank you, and have a wonderful afternoon. Thank you. Maintenant, est-ce que je peux avoir une motion pour adjourner?
Can I now have a motion to adjourn our meeting, please?
Thank you. Thank for our clerks, the helper, for our analyst, and all the staff over here.